When Picasso died in his 90s in 1973, he left £150 million worth of his own art. But he left no inventory and no will. And as his heirs included a wife, a son by a former wife, and 3 illegitimate children by 2 other women, French lawyers had a field day. In the end, good commercial sense prevailed, and in 1977, the French state found itself entitled to £30 million worth of that estate in lieu of death duties, having conveniently passed a law a short while earlier in order to make that possible. In a couple of years, there will be a Musée Picasso for all this in Paris, and fittingly, it was built by one of Louis XIV's tax collectors, largely out of his personal profits. In the meantime, the collection's a Picasso roadshow, and it's in London at the Arts Council's Hayward Gallery until October the 11th, trumpeted by much official publicity. Also by unofficial publicity, which actually tells you more about the unique popular appeal of this man than anything else. Cubism, however misunderstood, has become an international trademark. This, I suppose, is how we remember Picasso, in this photograph that greets us as we go in. Half king, half clown, agelessly old. In 1901, this is how he saw himself, at 20, in the earliest of the self-portraits, just after he'd settled in Paris. He looks hungry, as he probably was, romantically pale and melancholy. It's Picasso acknowledging the 19th century, and perhaps saying goodbye to it. 5 years later, all that poetic melancholy, all that soul, it's entirely gone. Wherever Picasso is going to lead the art of the 20th century, it's certainly not going to be about psychology. And it's not going to be about daily life, about people in cafes or people going to church. Not the Impressionist world at all, or the world of the camera. At just the moment in history when photography was making it commonplace to see the human face rendered absolutely accurately on a flat surface, Picasso turned his back on all that photographic realism. He wanted something much more timeless than a snapshot. He'd seen Egyptian art in the Louvre with that flattened look, and he'd seen the pre-Roman art of Spain, which was simple, primitive, stylized. And both of these seemed to him much more expressive than the ideal of truth to nature, which had dominated European art more or less since Raphael. What he wanted was the simple, expressive line. So he stripped himself to a few basics and tried to look like a primitive god. He could afford the luxury of abandoning conventional skills because he had them all. At 13, Picasso could certainly draw a plaster cast of a male torso better than his teachers. With some justification, he felt he could now get on with the real business of being an artist. Whenever Picasso was working towards something new, you often find his imagination centering on the image of a woman. Between 1906 and 8, Picasso made a series of experiments using heavy, muscular outlines to build an image of woman as monument. And nothing in the history of art was more monumental than the Greek marble caryatid. Not the classical caryatid, but much more primitive and sensual. It's this exaggeration, this emphasis on physical contours that appeals to him. The rectangle formed by the raised arms, the interlocking hands studied again and again, the rib cage slanting into the waist and curving outwards to form the buttocks. Reverse this shape and it becomes the hips and thighs. While the whole shape of hips and legs is echoed again in the calf muscles. Then from the side view, a different rhythm of contours. It's a year later, and Picasso has found another primitive influence, African carvings. The woman monument is not so sinuous, a lot heftier. but still this fascination for repeated patterns of anatomy echoed in the brushstrokes. Long before the term abstract art was on the lips of every art critic, Picasso was showing us that abstract shapes are everywhere. If you look at something, concentrate on something, you can end up with a kind of abstraction because you've stripped away everything else. Add colour and something else happens again. The lines soften and the forms blur. All this is Picasso's collection, the little things that he kept as if they were a diary or a writer's notebook. It's like reading the log of a sailor's journey into the unknown. Picasso's ideas often come simultaneously in painting and in sculpture. Here's woman as monument again, a massive statue of flesh if ever there was one. There's a lot of Rodin in this, and Degas. She might, of course, be enormous. In fact, she's tiny. At this point in Picasso's life, in his 20s, everything he's done so far has suggested creating new ways of making monumental figure paintings and sculpture. Massive groupings of nude figures, which of course had been a dominant preoccupation of European artists from Michelangelo right up to Cézanne. But now comes one of those abrupt changes of mood which are typical of Picasso, and his art suddenly becomes intensely private. All that fascination for the geometry of the monumental figure he started to apply to the little day-to-day domestic objects that lay around him. Things within reach, things you could touch, turn round, walk round, examine from all sides. And this, of course, is Cubism. Once you get over the irritation at finding it difficult and obscure, you may begin to find, at least I do, that these puzzles are among the most sensitive and delicate works of art of this century. Also that the pleasure in them is just the same as the pleasure you get out of any still life painting, whether it's by Chardin or Van Gogh or Cézanne. And that pleasure is something to do with being made aware of the very special relationship we all have with the little humdrum things that we surround ourselves with in our lives, and with the very personal, very revealing way that we arrange them and see them. Also, after all those monumental women, this is a predominantly male world. And maybe that's because for once in his life, the person closest to Picasso was a man, his fellow cubist, Georges Braque. What Picasso now wanted to do was to express on a single flat surface what all these things looked like and felt like from every possible angle. Each is like a dozen sketches all put together into one, a labyrinth, a puzzle. This sequence of drawings tells us quite a lot about Cubism because you can follow the development of a single idea over the course of just a few days at Avignon during the summer of 1914. He's like a composer who's got his theme right, his tune, if you like, and now sets to work making variations on it, often seeming to lose the tune, but never quite. The table is there, and the chair, the vertical of the torso, and the arm resting on the table with the folds in the jacket sleeve. now just 3 blades of shadow. He's also getting fond of the moustache, which was just an ordinary droopy one to begin with. Now it's beginning to anticipate Salvador Dali. The torso, that's all but gone. Without the head and the legs to make us read it as a body, it might be anything. Again, he's like a composer, twisting his theme about until he all but loses it, then snatching it back again at the very last minute, pushing everything to the brink to see just how far he can go, and always with a touch of wit. Is Picasso's tongue in his cheek or not? This still life, for instance. He's framed with a length of rope, thereby cocking a snook at all those elaborate gilt frames that try to make every art collector feel he's showing off a Rembrandt. And this strip of caning, to suggest that the newspaper, journal, lemon and glass are all resting on a chair, probably a cafe chair. But it's not real caning at all. The commercial oilcloth is printed in imitation of it. So here's another puzzle. What is real and what is not? The frame is, the picture isn't. Another dig at bourgeois values. European art is based on the illusion that a painting is real, that we're gazing at real objects in real space, when we're obviously not. It's a trick. Cubism smashes that illusion by giving us this multiple viewpoint condensed into one on a clearly flat surface. Not surprisingly, Picasso decided to do something more daring still, which was to give us this same multiple viewpoint, but with objects that were themselves three-dimensional. In other words, Cubist sculpture. These are the world's first junk sculpture. The first time a serious artist dared to suggest that you could make sculpture out of anything and into anything. This is called mandolin and clarinet. There was no point in copying real objects. You could take it for granted that we all know what a real guitar looks like. Or a violin, or a fruit bowl. What I think Picasso is saying is that anything around us that we know particularly well has a surface reality that we can see and we can photograph. But it also has a host of other realities that we can't see. Things like associations, sounds, the feel of it, what we feel about it. So that what we end up with is not, this is what it looks like, but this is what I feel about it. Cubist sculpture was the boldest experiment Picasso ever tried. And I have to admit that for me, they don't quite work. And the reason for this, I think, is that all these complicated angles and planes and shapes only really make sense when they're related to a flat surface, as they are with Cubist painting and drawing, and where the imagination has got to do the work of creating objects in space out of them. And yet the idea of making sculpture out of any old junk was a stroke of genius. A bull made from a bicycle saddle and handlebars. Far more real than if he'd modelled an actual bull's head, because it gives us this shock of recognizing the unexpected in what we'd never noticed before. Another Picasso conjuring trick. A bit of tube, 2 flower pots, a palm branch, a wicker basket, some bits of metal for its legs and feet. Touches of plaster here and there complete the most realistic nanny goat you've ever seen. The trouble is, being a Picasso nanny goat, she had a high market value, so there had to be a family of them to sell, reproduced in bronze. And much of the point of the original improvisation is lost. Picasso's youngest daughter, Paloma, used to get wheeled along the promenade in her pushchair. Picasso put his tongue in his cheek and recreated the scene out of cake tins, a stove plate, and for good measure, a real pushchair. Though again, the freshness and wit of his invention have got smothered by the bronze. Whereas this improvisation is still in its original state. A little owl, put together out of nails and the odd tools lying around Picasso's studio, all held together with plaster. All these improvisations are much later, almost 40 years after the first Cubist sculpture here. And I jumped ahead simply to show how much freshness and wit came out of this invention of junk sculpture. Once he'd eventually got round to using it to evoke something living and not dead. There's a gap in this exhibition hereabouts, and that gap is the First World War. In fact, from Picasso's work, you wouldn't have any idea that there'd been a war at all. He was a man far too interested in himself to be a political painter, at least until the Spanish Civil War. What you do get here, in one small picture, is the statement that war is totally irrelevant to him, because this is a honeymoon picture. It's Biarritz in the summer of 1918, just 4 months before the armistice. Picasso had fallen in love with a dancer from Diaghilev's Russian ballet called Olga Koklova and married her. Out of Cubism, it's an extraordinary leap, from that small, enclosed world of pipe smokers to the frolic of the beach. It's as if Picasso needed a breath of fresh air, needed to paint about women again. Whatever we may feel about Picasso after Cubism is bound up with what we feel about his view of women, because from now onwards they dominate his work. They are his passions, his possessions, his meat, or as here, his playthings. They writhe in an ecstasy of sunbathing. Or they rush about, possessed by some inner demon. Invariably, they're on a beach. After Biarritz, it's Dinard. The seaside is always an unreal place to Picasso, a place where people strip themselves of civilization and the old myths come alive. Juan Les Pins. A woman reclining like a Greek statue is dumped on the sand to read a letter. Others do equally idle things, splash about, or peer at a distant aeroplane. 1920, a rare enough event. And suddenly, such tenderness. Picasso continually surprises us with moments of sentiment. She strokes her son's back. He prods at a sleeping boy who hides his sex as he hides his identity from us. Who is he? We don't know. Nor what the picture means. A moment of peace on another beach. Antibes this time, 1923. And then Dinard, 1928. Picasso's off again, inventing new languages. Now the woman is some kind of stick insect. She crowds the whole picture with her arms and legs. She's ludicrous and a bit menacing. The black rocks carry a hint of menace too. And so does the silhouette of a man against the beach hut. What's he doing there? There's a whole series of these dinar pictures. They're all very small, and they all combine this frolic of human insects with furtive things going on in beach huts and behind locked doors. The recurrent images of the beach ball and the quay. Sometimes we know almost too much about Picasso's private life, but at other times it supplies certain clues. For instance, the catalogue says, when Picasso went en famille to Dinard in 1928, Marie-Thérèse was clandestinely installed in the same town. In other words, the key to the quay is the new mistress installed round the corner, while the wife he's now tired with plays with their son on the beach. Picasso was approaching 50, and Marie-Thérèse was 18. And for the next 8 years, she is the focus of his art in the way that no private relationship had ever been before. He hardly ever painted her naturalistically. We have very little idea what she looked like, though he painted her in a variety of moods and attitudes, sleeping curled up, as rounded and brightly coloured as the fruit she lies by. Or pink as a meringue under a canopy of flowers. Or with her head resting on a table in front of green shutters. Distortion combined with delicacy again. So often she's a passive creature about the house. These studies of Marie-Thérèse from the 1930s are about the closest he got to being a painter of domestic interiors. She reads the newspaper in front of an open window, and Picasso paints her using that simplified form of the Cubist language he now employs whenever he feels like it. And the almost gloating way he notices how the rounded shapes of the chair and the window catch echo the roundness of her breasts. And yet, the years with Marie-Thérèse unlock some very vicious passions in Picasso. This is his version of David's famous painting of the death of Marat, murdered in his bath at the time of the French Revolution. But whereas David left the murderess out altogether, Picasso has her dominate the scene, stabbing Marat with a stiletto and reducing him to a bleeding pinhead. Sex becomes a kind of war to the death, painted in the colors of blood. Woman is the mantis who lures her mate and gobbles him up. Mouths made for kissing are also made for devouring. Tongues become daggers. The male, as if to get his own back on these devouring women, uses brute force to violate what he desires. And in the midst of all this lusty pandemonium, the ceremonial savagery of the bullfight. The brute male, the gored victim. Between them, the helpless human being, mere humanity, destroyed by primitive forces. Picasso's view of passions is very rarely a pretty one, and neither is his view of women. In fact, increasingly as he advances towards old age, his view of women approximates to rape. He gets away with it because he's such a towering genius, but underneath that genius, he really is a rather terrifying thug. The question is, does it matter? Maybe not. Art is not, after all, a sermon. But what it does mean is that from about this time onwards, it becomes increasingly hard to like Picasso whenever his passions are roused. And then, typically of Picasso, when one source of energy becomes rather rotten, another or others become fertile. And always the thread of that energy and what links his different personalities is drawing and engraving. They are what he constantly falls back on for refreshment. Again, his line is like the hand of a pianist playing with a theme, trying it this way and that. With the political world darkening around him, the Spanish Civil War, then the Second World War looming, more and more Picasso relates the dramas of his life in terms of mythology. The bull becomes the Cretan Minotaur, part human, part monster, with Picasso's own face. There are hundreds of them, these self-portraits in mythological disguise, and they pour out of him during the last decades of his life. Virtuoso drawings. Sometimes the mood is pensive, sometimes bawdy, outdoing Rubens. Often it's a clash between brutality and tenderness, which Picasso loves, always dwelling on the theme of strength and the sapping of strength, of creative powers, sexual powers. A note of voyeurism creeps in. And in extreme old age, the voyeurism becomes black humor, pathetic and self-mocking. Lust making a monkey out of him. Elegies for lost potency. Until at 90, all he can do is paint. Only a man who loved himself deeply for better or for worse could have left us such a candid record of old age, as ruthlessly honest as the self-portraits of Rembrandt. I don't think that you can look at any of these post-Second World War paintings and say that Picasso enjoyed an Indian summer in his old age. Not like Titian or Monet or Picasso's own contemporary, Matisse. It's as though Picasso went on churning out Picassos night and day, and collectors signed enormous checks for them, but somehow the fires have gone out. And then you look at something like this, done when Picasso was 80. Because the one thing Picasso never lost was the marvelous sharpness of his eye and this sense of line. Because to the very end, Picasso remains the draftsman of the 20th century, whether it's with a pencil or a pair of shears. And this piece, it goes back to an obsession Picasso had more than half a century earlier, that of woman as monument. Well, I like to save my last energies at any exhibition for going back to see again the pieces that I've enjoyed most, the ones that I would like to take away with me, if I were allowed, say, 6. I'd have The Owl, 1953, because it's the perfect do-it-yourself sculpture. Great art can be instant. Picasso must have swept up a few scraps from the studio floor and made it in half an hour. Minotaur and Dead Mare, 1936. I'd never know for sure what it meant, but the images would haunt me, and I'd find myself thinking about it. Family by the Sea, 1923. As gentle a picture as Picasso ever painted, a 20th century old master. Smoker at a Table, 1914. A reminder that Cubism was never a theory, but a way of looking at life. Bust of a Woman, 1907. Just a sketch of a mask, but with more character than 100 photographs. Finally, Picasso himself at 20, before he had any inkling of the fame and rumpus and wealth that were to descend on him. He gazes into himself impassively, like a terrorist about to hurl a bomb into the 20th century.